Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. One of the questions on the exam is this one. It says, first of all, let's read the instructions. Read and respond to the following questions carefully. You should have answered them in your notebook, but you may need to revise your original responses. So here's in the question itself, they're asking us to basically do a thoughtful job, do a neat job, like with the Hassan, so to speak. And then let's read the question. The question says, one of the ways an author develops a character is by describing how the character interacts with the setting. One of the ways an author develops a character is by describing how the character interacts with the setting. How does Elizabeth, from the story Marigold, feel about her town? So that's the question. So we are asked to write an essay about how she feels about her town. Cite textual evidence from early part of the story and explain how this evidence reveals the effect the setting has on Elizabeth and how Elizabeth interacts with the setting. So we want to know what she feels about her town. This question is about a very broad literary topic, about literature in general, about how authors develop character. What does it mean, anyways, to develop character? So that's what I like to talk about briefly today. Now, see, if you have a friend and you know this friend very well, right? So then you know what they would do and what they would not do in particular circumstances. So let's say you have a friend and you know this friend and somebody says, you know what your friend did the other day? He did this and this and this. You said, no way. My friend would never do something like that. I know him very well. He would never do something like that. So in other words, you know your friend well enough so you can almost predict how they would interact in different circumstances. In the same way, you get to know quite a bit about a character in a story. And the character in a story, once you get to know them, you say, this character would do, certain things in certain times, and you would expect him to behave in a certain way. So just like we get to know other people, we can in fact get to know other characters in a story. So how does an author tell us or reveal about a character in a story? If you've read Sherlock Holmes, you know that Sherlock Holmes is very different from his good friend Dr. Watson. They have very different personalities, and Sherlock Holmes would act in a certain way, and Watson would act in a certain way. You wouldn't confuse the two of them because they are so different. How do we know that? Because they are written that way. Now remember, these are imaginary characters. How did the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, develop those characters? Right? How do we know that they will behave in a certain way? There are many different ways that we get to understand a character. Just like in life, there are many different ways you can understand a person. For example, you could see a person from a distance, and just by the way they treat, for example, a poor person, like you see a person who's reasonably well-to-do, and they see a poor person, and how they dismiss the poor person, or if they're kind to the poor person, it tells a lot about a person. Without ever meeting this person, you can say something about their personality. Well, maybe they were just having a bad day or something like that, just by the way they treat other people, right? So even without meeting people, you can say a lot about them. In the same way, you can tell about the character of a particular story by various different methods, by using many different ways. One very important way of getting to know a character is simply what the author says about them. Okay? So the author might actually just describe the character. That means the author is just described. Now, you have to understand there's two separate words. There's the author, right? And there's a narrator. Okay? So these are two separate words that we have to be able to discriminate. So author is the person who is writing the story, okay? The person who's writing the story. So this might be sometimes more appropriate to say what the narrator says. A narrator is whoever the speaking voice of the author is, right? So the author is the person who's writing the story. And so a person I might write, for example, a story about a small boy. But the story would be the boy says, when I live in Iowa, small town Iowa, and in our backyard we have chickens and all that. So obviously the story is told by the little boy. So the little boy is the narrator. Okay, so whoever the narrator is the person who's telling the story in the story. But who's writing the story? That's the author, the one who's typing it in the computer or whatever. So you have to understand the difference between the term author, the person who's writing the story, and the narrator, or the person who's saying the story in the story. Okay? So in the Marigolds, for example, Elizabeth is the narrator. The girl is the narrator. But the author of the story, Eugenia Collier, that's her name, Marigolds. The author of the story Marigolds is Eugenia Collier, and the narrator is Elizabeth. So that's very important. So how do we know about a particular character in a story? Well, one way to know is what the narrator or author says about that. So the author might say, Elizabeth is like this and this and this, or Holmes is like this and this and this. In fact, in one of the beginning stories of Sherlock Holmes, Watson describes Holmes in very detailed fashion. So simply what the narrator or author is saying about the character in a story. And then the character themselves might describe themselves. So what the character says about themselves. So what the character says about themselves. Okay? So let's say I'm going to draw a little stick figure here. Let's say this is the character, and the question is, how do we know about this character? One way is that the narrator or the author describes the character. Okay? And the second way is that the character themselves describe themselves. They talk about themselves in the story. And they don't have to describe it. Sometimes they're just thinking in the story. They're not telling you that this is who I am. They're just thinking. They're reflecting, and then from there we learn that, oh, this person is kind of sad, or they're angry at something. They didn't tell you that they were sad or angry, but their words, by the time you're done reading it, it's pretty clear to you that they are sad, or they're angry, or they're happy, or etc., or they're afraid. So you can look at the words of the characters as they're speaking, and as the words of the characters as they're thinking. So the character might just plainly describe themselves, or what they're thinking might also give it to you. The other thing is how one character interacts with another character in the story. So if there's more than one character in the story, here's a person, and they're interacting with the second character in the story, how this person interacts with this other person also tells us about the character. Just like the person that I said, how a person interacts with the poor person might give you an idea of what kind of personality that is. So either by their actions, they don't even have to talk with each other, by their actions and conversations, so they can talk with each other, or they don't even have to talk, or by their actions, simply how they interact with each other. For example, a character could just go to work in the morning, and they're just not saying anything to anybody. They're not saying hello, they're not smiling. That itself is very revealing about their particular character. So how a character interacts with other characters is very important. And the character can also interact with the environment, right? So they can have, for example, a character says, I hate the town that I grew up in, or I love the town I grew up in. We went to swimming pool in the park, and went this and this. So how they interact with their environment also says a lot about the character. Correct? So what a character, what the author or the narrator is saying about the character, the narrator or the author saying the character, what the character is saying about themselves, or what they're thinking about themselves, how they interact with other characters, how they interact with the environment, can tell us a lot about who the character is. Okay. The second thing is just what the character does in a story can tell us a lot about it. Like in Marigolds, what does Elizabeth do? well, she gets upset and destroys the flowers, right? So what does that say about her? It tells us about it. So the action of the story, what happens in the story, reveals itself. In fact, the characters can change in the story from the beginning to end based on what happens. So there are many ways that we can learn about the characters in a story. One, simply by what the narrator says about them. Secondly, what the character says about themselves, or the character's thinking, or how the character interacts with other characters in the story, and how the character interacts with their environment, and finally what actually happens in the story. So you can see that many ways we learn about a character in a particular story. The question here asked, what do we know about Elizabeth, or what does he think about Elizabeth, and by looking at the environment. In fact, the story begins like this. I can just tell you, even with the reading reference to the story, that she grew up in an environment where it was very dusty and muddy and hot and things like that. And so what does she think about that environment? Does she like it? Does she dislike it? And etc. So these are many different ways that we learn about a character. The second aspect of this question is that we are asked in this question to write a thoughtful essay. So I just want to make a few comments on what makes for a thoughtful essay or a paragraph. So the essence of any particular writing, in my mind, the essence of in any particular writing is a paragraph. In other words, if you are able to write a good paragraph, if you're able to write a good paragraph, all right, then you can on your way of writing to becoming a good writer. So if you want to become a good writer, you want to focus on writing good paragraphs. So that's very, very important. So there are elements of what makes for a good paragraph. Okay, so imagine that this is a paragraph. So the essence of good writing, as I stated, is the ability to write a good paragraph. All right. So if then I'm restating that, but because it's so important. If you want to become a good writer, then you want to focus on writing paragraphs. In my mind, good paragraphs. And in fact, and then the essence of paragraphs is writing beautiful sentences. So you have to write sentences well, and you have to write paragraphs well. If you work on those two things, you can write pretty much anything, and inshallah that will be come out to be very, very good, inshallah. So the paragraph, if this represents a paragraph here, it has some very important components. Okay, the first very important thing is that the first sentence of the paragraph should be like an introductory statement. Okay, so the first statement should be an introductory statement, and ideally the last statement should be a reasonable, like, concluding statement as possible. Okay, so a good paragraph will have an introductory statement and a concluding statement, and in between these two statements will be the details of what you want to write. So this is detail number 1, detail number 2, detail number 3, detail number 4. Okay, so now let's say I give you a topic. Okay, the topic would be, okay, why I like basketball. All right, so then you would have an introductory statement, and then you would give all your reasons why you like basketball. Reason number 1, reason number 2, reason number 3, and reason number 4, and then concluding, for all these reasons I like basketball. So an introductory statement, a concluding statement, and the details. Okay, specific evidence, specific reasons, etc. Details here. Now, a paragraph should have at least 5 or 6 sentences in my mind. So, it can have 5 sentences to make a decent paragraph, depending on how long your sentences are too, right? So in this course, at least, if we aim for 5 or 6 sentences, it'd be a very good thing. Now, I'll give you some suggestion, advice on how to do this, because in general, students are afraid of writing because they're afraid of them making mistakes, or making them writing things that they don't like and they are embarrassed by it or something like that. We have to get over it, because unless you're willing to brave it and write something, you'll never improve, because the only way you will improve is by writing. All right. So, so how do you make a paragraph a good paragraph? The first thing to do is, if you want to write a paragraph, don't worry about how it looks. The first paragraph, the first writing of a paragraph, you have to assume that it's going to be terrible. So you want to make sure that the first paragraph you write is reasonably terrible looking, because you don't want it to be perfect necessarily. Okay, so you just understand the first time you write the paragraph, it not look very good, but that's okay, because you can edit it. By the time you're done editing the paragraph, it should look reasonably decent and presentable. But when you're writing it first, just get your thoughts in the paper. So the most important aspect of writing a paragraph or writing an essay is to first just write, the rough draft, or just write a bad essay, a bad paragraph. Don't worry about how the grammar is, etc. Just write it. Just put something on paper, and don't worry about how pretty it looks, because that's revision. So when you first write the paragraph, it could be terrible, and that's okay, because when you get an opportunity to improve on it later. So the first thing to understand is, don't worry about how it looks in the beginning. It's more important to get the thoughts in the paper. And if you're making an argument, if you're supporting, like this question asks you, what does she think about them, and why do you think this? You have to gather your evidence. If you want to gather your evidence, you want to get at least 4 bits of information. 4 bits, because you're going to have to write a 5-6 paragraph essay. One of them will be introductory, right? One of them may be concluding paragraph. So you have to grab 4 bits of information. So you have to read, in this case, you'd have to read the textbook, read the story, and find 4 pieces of evidence that you say, this is how she interacts with the environment. The reason number 1, this is number 2. So you look for the clues. So when you have 4 points, you can write them as notes. Point number 1, detail number 1, detail number 2, detail number 3, detail number 4. So you write them over here, and as sketches, 1 or 2 words like this, and then have them ready. And then you write introductory statement, and then you write the paragraph. Okay. Now, 2 more things I want to tell you before I finish here. A good paragraph has two important ideas associated. 2 important characteristics. Okay. Let me put it this way. A good paragraph is unified. Okay? And the good paragraph is also coherent. Okay, now what does that mean? A unified paragraph means that all sentences, okay, they are related to the topic. Okay? So, in other words, everything that you write, so if I was to write about basketball and why I like basketball, this has to relate to basketball. This statement has to relate to basketball. This statement has to relate to basketball. This statement has to relate to basketball. And even the concluding sentence has to relate to the basketball. Okay? In other words, if I'm writing a paragraph about basketball, I say, I like basketball because it's an exciting sport. It's like a minute-to-minute based competition. Anybody can win, anybody can lose. It's a fun game to watch and play. Okay, and then, oh, by the way, I also like table tennis. Forget why you're talking about table tennis. You're talking about basketball, right? So that's what we mean by unified. If you're talking about basketball, don't somewhere to put in the table tennis in there. Why are you messing with the table tennis if you're talking about basketball? So a good paragraph will have it will be unified. That means every statement, every sentence of the paragraph will support the original topic. So every sentence in the paragraph has to support the original topic. The second aspect of a good paragraph is that it is coherent. The coherence means it flows logically, A to B to C. It means there's a logical progression. Okay. So in other words, it shouldn't be like, you know, from one idea to another idea to another idea. It should make reasonable sense from going from here to here to here. If you were writing about a cooking recipe, it would make sense to describe it in order, right? You wouldn't like describe the cooking recipe like how to cook something like in all kind of weird mix and match. Okay, first you chop off your vegetables and this, and oh, by the way, later on you're going to have to saute this, so you might as well, right? That doesn't make sense. You don't go all, you go in a certain logical progression. So so you have, your thoughts have to, from one to another to another to another, they have to flow. You can't be like, you know, jumping up and down like erratic thinking. So these are two very important concepts that hopefully will have an opportunity to develop in the future. So I described to you two very important aspects of answering these test questions. One aspect is, in general, how do you analyze characters in any particular story? We analyze, we appreciate, we get to know a character in many different ways, by what the narrator is saying about the character, by what the character is saying about themselves, what the character is thinking, and how the character is interacting with other characters in the story, and how the character is interacting with the environment, and what the character is actually doing. Okay. So that's how we get to know any character. There's some ways that we get to know characters in a story. The other aspect is I described to you how to write a good paragraph. Some basic recommendations. One is that a good paragraph will have an introduction and concluding statement, and it will have supporting details sandwiched in between. And a good paragraph is unified, meaning everything that's in the paragraph has to do with the topic of the paragraph, and there's no random stuff that's put in there that have nothing to do with the topic. And finally, a good paragraph is coherent, meaning that it has a logical progression of ideas, so it makes sense. Where one sentence flows into the next sentence, and flows into the next sentence, like this. Inshallah, we'll have an opportunity to talk more about this in the future. As-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.